Andrew Marin is the president and founder of the Marin Foundation, an organization committed to building bridges between the LGBT community and conservative Christians through biblical and social education, scientific research, and diverse community gatherings. He is also the author of the award-winning book, Love is an Orientation. And since 2010, Andrew has been asked by the United Nations to advise their various agencies on bridging opposing worldviews, civic engagement, and theological aspects of reconciliation. Andrew lives in Boys Town neighborhood of Chicago with his wife, Brenda. Welcome to Jim Henderson Presents. So Andrew, you are a very busy guy, and why don't you give us an example, some idea about what your life looks like these days in terms of travel and the various groups that you're being invited to talk to?
Yeah, you know, actually we just got back from a month-long stint in Australia and New Zealand, and so I'm still suffering from jet lag a little bit there. But we had 41 different engagements in the 24 days with LGBT groups and with Christian groups and conservative groups and progressive groups and gay churches, and we spoke in the Australian Parliament and really across the board. And you know, I think the unique thing about what's been happening with us recently is just how our bridge building message, because for us it's less about what you believe and more about what you do with what you believe. And so this bridge building message has just really started to spread. And you know, I've been gone on the road probably, you know, 15, 17 days a month. Wow. Universities, churches, gay and lesbian community centers, government agencies, really just all across the board. And so it's really been a humbling thing. You never really start something and think, oh man, well, it's going to be this and this and this. And so it's just been an interesting ride recently. Well, recently
you were the subject of an opinion piece in the New York Times by Dan Savage, where he compared the Marin Foundation with the Westboro Baptist Church Group,
right?
Which is, those are fighting words.
Yeah, well, or hugging words.
Hugging words.
Either one, it depends.
Yes, I understand. I'll let you do this. So, you know, what was interesting is I read his attack, or his approach to you was basically he accused you of being homophobic with the hugs, and I'd like you to comment on that. But before I do that, I want to read something that I read by a gay gentleman who actually came to your defense, who's a friend of yours. He said, the Marin Foundation isn't about being gay or pro-gay or anti-gay or ex-gay or even pro-Christian. It's about connecting with people who don't agree with you in the tension-filled area where faith and sexuality intersect, and learning how to understand each other a bit more effectively. So I thought that was a nice place to start the conversation.
Yeah.
Go ahead and talk more about that.
Brian McLaren says it best, I think. He says, if you're going to act as a bridge, you're going to get walked on from both sides. Now, there's a lot of people. I mean, when we get attacked in the media, whether it's from a more progressive perspective or a more conservative perspective, right. Every single time there will be a litany of comments on, you know, Facebook and Twitter and all these places, and they'll say, hey, if you're getting attacked from both sides, you're doing something right. And it's like the first thing that runs through my head is, well, you are obviously not the person getting attacked from both sides, because it's just like, it's no good, you know. But this is the space that we're in, and I mean, scripturally, from my understanding, Jesus said, I came to bring the sword, and it's going to be mother against daughter, and father against son, and brother against brother, you know. And it's not like Jesus came and to literally drop a hammer on people and kill and divide. He was saying, my way is going to be so countercultural to what is deemed as the acceptable medium of engagement that people are either going to be totally for it or they're going to be completely against it.
And that would be regardless of the extreme position they're coming from. You're speaking of conservatives or progressives when you're saying
right,
that.
Right, exactly. And that's the space we're in, you know. And so the funny thing is, our message is about nuance, and yet the people who are for us there's no nuance to the people who are for us. They just ride or die and have our back, and it's no matter what. And then the people who are against us or against this message, once again, there's no nuance in it. It's either ride or die, we hate you, and this or that. And but just briefly about the Dan Savage thing, you know, it almost gets to a laughable state when someone compares us to Westboro Baptist or an ex-gay ministry or I mean, whatever, an activist organization, whatever the situation is. And so that's why in my public response for what Dan wrote in the New York Times, I had a number of gay and lesbian people who have known us for years, who have been part of our organization for years. And in essence, I'm saying in that response piece, listen, I know you're not going to believe me.
Right.
That's okay. So listen to people like yourself.
Right.
And now you have to make the choice. Are you going to throw one of your own people under the bus as well and call them a liar? Because it's easier to call me a liar. Right. Or what are you going to do? And the unfortunate thing is that we haven't heard back from anybody. So
I'm shocked.
Not surprising.
One of the things you said is that Dan and I have completely different philosophical approaches to social change. Both the same goal. Mm-hmm. So you would agree on some points of his work. You're trying to do some of the same work that Dan Savage is doing.
Yeah, without a doubt. You know, his It Gets Better campaign is just off the charts fantastic. I mean, it has...
In what ways?
Well, it's literally saved the lives of so many people, especially so many Christian teenagers who are gay, and they don't know. You know, there are a lot of people who come from these small towns, or they think they're the only one like this,
right.
or if I come out, my church is going to hate me, and my family's going to hate me. What's going to happen? And to see the millions and millions of people get involved with that, to say, listen, here I am on the other side of that, and it does get better, and it is okay. That's something that is good, and I think both Dan and I ultimately want the best for someone. We want them to feel loved, and we want them to feel secure and safe and dignified and cherished, and I would say cherished as a child of God, though Dan would not agree with that statement, and that's okay.
Right.
But those are both of our outcomes, and they both fit together, but we just, as you mentioned, we have two completely different philosophical approaches on how to get to that outcome. Right. And Dan's is a lot more shock jock. It is a lot more antagonistic and bulldog-like, and you know, and I would like to see us and the Marin Foundation, ours is more about in this pluralistic culture that we live in, where there are so many variety and competing worldviews against each other.
Well, you use the example of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and let's say Stokely Carmichael. Those are all people that were competing in the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. I know we're not trying to compare that, but this is just functionally social change that's occurring.
Yeah.
As they were competing basically against each other for market share about how their ideas were going to play out.
And as you look at the system and structure, so as you said, I'm not comparing here Martin Luther King and the civil rights struggle to the modern day LGBT equality rights struggle. But if you look at the two systems of social change, it's really the same thing. In any given society, in any given culture where there is this national shift going on, you're going to have the people that are the ardent activists. You're going to have the people that are fight first and ask questions later, accuse first, ask questions later. And then you're going to have the people who say, listen, man, in this variety of competing worldviews, we need to work together to have this sustainable change happen. It is sociologically, anthropologically, diplomatically, research proves that a society cannot sustainably shift unless the oppressors and those who are oppressed end up coming together, working together to create a better, more safer, more dignified type of world. And that's what we're trying to do.
So that would include you even co-belligerating with someone like Dan on different issues. You would actually partner with them, even though at times we're different. You know, we move away from each other. Then there's times we actually come together. So one of the things that comes up is in the progressive world, it is popular to talk about being inclusive, and you know, I want you to talk about this word inclusion because you make the comment, you know, that inclusion doesn't mean only including the people that I want to include.
Right.
That's called segregation. And talk about that in the context of pluralistic society. About why those things are in tension, and then why that's important to you that we actually practice inclusion, especially as a follower of Jesus, right? Because we would not be known for this, you know.
Well, no, we would not. Fumbling on my words. No, we would not. You got that one right, Jim. Yeah, here's the interesting thing to me, and you know, it starts back. Let's look back to the history of our country, and let's go back to our Constitution. And the Constitution says, that everybody is dignified and everybody is created equal and everybody is this or that. And yet, when Thomas Jefferson was writing that, he had hundreds of slaves and slave masters that whipped those slaves and beat those slaves and were looked at as not even one full human person. So this juxtaposition of inequality has been going on for so long under the guise of inclusion, cultural inclusion. Then it moves on forward and we keep going. And so here we find ourselves today. And the problem that I have is that majority, the progressive world today, is saying we are the inclusive ones. And what they're saying is inherently correct, because they are saying, look, we include the women, and we include the gay and lesbian people, and we include the minorities, and we include everybody that the dominant power structure has not wanted to include for generations.
And by implication, that dominant power structure has been influenced by the Christian culture in the United States.
Hugely. So what happens though is that still, once again, if we look at the structure and the system of inclusion for what's happening, the progressive movement today is taking that word inclusion, and yet what they are doing is implementing the same system of oppression that they ran away from to create their progressive world, because they said, hey, you conservatives, look at you. You're a bunch of white, straight males who only include the people you want to include. And that doesn't include us. And so we're going to start our own thing. Now, here's the funny thing. So you have the progressive world today, and we're including women and gay and lesbians and minorities and all this. And so my question is, okay, if you are being truly inclusive, would you then also include that fundy, conservative, super right-wing person? And the answer I get every time is, no, heck no, I wouldn't include that. Well, then you're not being inclusive. You are labeling inclusion and defining it as, I will include only the people I want to include, which is the same thing that happened from the white straight males for all these years. And so we're just trying to practice an actual ethic of inclusion that, regardless of who you are, where you come from, what you believe, we need to function in this holistic space that we can learn what it means to reclaim an active, peaceful and productive engagement together.
So some Christians believe that we should stand up for our rights, that we should, it's a democracy, and we've had a lot of influence in that democracy in the shape of it. So our tactic then is to basically double down and to resist gay people or whoever it is currently that, is trying to take our rights, our moral rights, or what we have then. How do you address the issue of this idea that we want to protect the morality of our country, and therefore Christians need to stand up and articulate that, because if they don't, who's going to?
Right. And I have no problem with people who have a theological and moral ethic of absolute truth, of their understanding of what Scripture says and how they interpret that. That's great. I have no problem with that. And we are fortunate enough to live in a country that does promote the ability to vote and be an independent and free thinker and all of these things. But what we have to understand, though, is that just because we might think that our understanding of absolute truth or our ethic of morality or whatever the situation is, though we might think that is indeed better, it doesn't mean that anyone else around us is going to agree with us, and it is ultimately up to a vote. And here's the interesting thing, politics is inherently win-lose. And now our bridge building is about how do we come up with mutually beneficial, peaceful, and productive outcomes. It's very hard to do politically when it's either a law or policy gets implemented or it doesn't. It passes or it doesn't, And so what we're trying to say is, how can we holistically engage any given topic that says there is a human rights aspect, there is a legal aspect, and then there is a moral aspect. And so we need to take all three of these aspects to come together to come to our conclusion, and then figure out how to work with other people.
Well, doesn't the whole marriage issue fall in this category of gay rights and about being married in our culture, in a pluralistic society? How do we, I'm not really looking for kind of a theological comment. I'm more interested in just politically or legally how you view that. And because I personally think it's a non-issue in terms of that if you're in a pluralistic society and the society says this is what we're going to do, then that they should have the right to marry. So what's your take on that?
Well, you might say that, but the RNC just a week and a half ago came out and reaffirmed their stance of how they understand a traditional marriage.
Right.
So you and 50% of the country
Right.
think, well, yeah, of course they're American citizens and they deserve the same rights, and
Right.
so let's give it to them. Well, there still is another half of our country who doesn't align with that perspective. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is at least help try and educate people in this holistic understanding of these three silos or categories. So yes, there is a human rights aspect to it. And so the question that I challenge people to think about then, specifically from a more conservative perspective, is do two U.S. citizens of the same sex deserve the same right to get married as two U.S. citizens of opposite sex? And then we have the legal question, which, as we know, legally, married couples in the United States of America can get up to 1,400 extra benefits.
That's correct, 1,438.
Then, yeah, there you've done your homework. Than non-married couples, even common law marriages or civil unions.
And that's up in question about the notion of common law marriage.
Exactly. So the legal question conservatives need to ask themselves are, and especially for the constitutionalists, which these days a lot of the more conservative and Republican folks are going more towards a constitutionalist perspective. So then the question becomes, do two U.S. citizens of the same sex deserve the same legal protection under the law of the United States of America through the Constitution as two U.S. citizens of the opposite sex? Right. And then the third question is ultimately the morality issue, is how does your moral ethic or your theological understanding play with these other two? And what we're telling people to do is, we're not here to tell people how they need to vote, but the moment that someone looks at this just as a social justice issue and takes out the moral piece, that's not a holistic understanding. The moment that someone takes the moral piece and takes out the human rights and the legal aspect, it's not. So we need to take this as a whole.
And that's in order to keep a conversation going.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
So one of the things you just did that I understand you like to do is avoid saying yes or no. And so, and our friend Brian McLaren calls that hiding out in the open, and which I like. But you do that because you have another agenda, actually, that is of more interest to you in many ways than what conclusions people come to about these issues, I would suggest from reading you. And that is that you have this thing called holy uncomfortableness that you like to put people into. So describe that. And then you said more, you said more and more progressive groups, there's different kinds of groups that are joining in on this. I'd love to hear a story about particularly some progressive group, and a conservative group as well, that's like joining in. Yeah. That's kind of you're surprised by.
Right,
to this pool of holy uncomfortableness.
Yeah, totally. Well, originally what happened, so I moved into the gay neighborhood here in Chicago after my three best friends came out to me. And when I moved in, I saw this very clear dichotomy right from the first day, and it was, you're on our side or you're not, or you're their side or you're not. And then my church world that I came from, they were saying, you can't move into the neighborhood, you're on our team, and you're on, so it was this big pull. And I thought, man, there's got to be some type of uncomfortable space that we can all enter into, because I'll tell you what happens today, Jim. There are a lot of cowards behind keyboards. And people are not accountable for what they say behind a computer screen, and they can anonymously say whatever, and then when you meet them face to face, they're not as bold as they are behind that computer screen. So I thought, let's
Spoken as a true ex-athlete.
Well, you know how it goes. So let's throw it all together and see what happens. And so over the years, we started this Living in the Tension gathering, which has been going on almost 10 years now. And but from that, a couple years into it, I read Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. And in this letter, he says, I am not afraid of the word tension. I've earnestly opposed violent tension my whole life, but there's a type of constructive and nonviolent tension which produces growth. And I think there were two keys to what he was saying. The first key is constructive tension. Our culture knows not what constructive tension looks like anymore, because we all think it's too bad, it's too political, it's too divisive. And yet, there is a type of constructive tension when you intentionally immerse yourself in, the growth that King talks about will come. The difference is that the growth only comes retrospectively after much time has been immersed in these places. So our thought was, what are the two biggest dichotomized populations in today's society?
Right.
Let's put them in the same room at the same time over a significant period of time and see what happens. And the interesting thing over the last decade of what we have seen, what happens? Relationship and love. And
then what happens?
And agreement and disagreement
Right.
become secondary issues.
Right.
The primary issue is the fidelity or the faithfulness that we have to each other.
In our relationship.
In our shared humanity, and our common understanding of all these things. And all of a sudden, we started seeing people join together and start doing work. The biggest misnomer in contemporary society is that people have to agree in order to love well. And I just don't believe that.
Well, and I like to say, you know, that 1 Corinthians 13, it says that now remain these three, faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is truth. and that's what we've inherited, really, is this notion I have to have the right truth, and then therefore we have to agree, you know, and two don't agree, how can they be together, blah, blah, blah. And that's the stuff that we've been handed to us. And any system is you know, in danger of going down that road. You know, what I call this is when people like each other, the rules change. And I find it fascinating. Human beings, it seems so certain about their position. Once they start to like each other, they can become less certain. And like, how did they become less certain?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, it's about being together, you know? That's the point. It's about this uncomfortable tension. And it's amazing to us to see when we offer a new medium of engagement, when we say the current cultural acceptable medium of engagement, just because it's culturally acceptable doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's good, doesn't mean it's worthwhile or productive. And so we offer a new space to be able to hold on to your convictions, to be able to hold on to your truth, and yet understand what it means to build bridges, connect faithfulness with someone from the opposing worldview as yourself. The dominant cultural narrative before this always used to be, you pick a side, and when you agree with that side, 50% of the people are going to love you, and you have a common enemy, and you can just go back and forth, but you will know you are at least supported by this entity of people. And why isn't that satisfying
to you, to just join that club?
Well, there's a difference, but anybody can build an army, you know? I can scrounge up hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of people around the world that think like me and act like me and believe like me and vote like me and talk like me and look like me. And the interesting thing of that is so many fight, Dan Savage, for instance, you know, he fights for he's an atheist, and he fights for a dominant pluralistic worldview in our country. Well, I mean, the inherent definition of a pluralistic society means there are differing and competing and varying worldviews that all have to coexist in this space that we call America or Earth or whatever it is. And yet, their dominant narrative is, if you don't agree with me, then you're wrong, or you're bad, or you're stupid, or you're Westboro Baptist Church.
Right.
And that is just not the case. And I would like to clear this up. Can we stop calling Westboro Baptist Church a church? It's a family of like 10 people.
Shows that you don't have to be big to be influential.
Amen, dude. I guess.
It's incredible. You know? Small groups change the world.
It was funny. I was looking at their Twitter account recently. And one of them tweeted, "You couldn't pay for this press. We've never spent $1 on marketing, and we're all over the place." And it's like, hey, dude, there's something to say about that. But so you know, it's interesting how it works out.
Okay, so I want to talk to you about Jesus, because it seems to me that these convictions that you hold, or this curiosity that you have to cultivate these relationships, comes from somewhere. You know, and I want to ask you about this word, the incarnation, and I want to know if that word is merely a theological word, meaning, you know, it's kind of inside the Christian ghetto, it has meaning, and then, or is it actually a word about reality? Is it in your thinking? Because it seems to me that you're taking those impulses and those drives and desires, and you're trying to extend them outside of the normal space. Talk to me about how Jesus and the incarnation has influenced you in that regard.
Yeah, no, totally. You know, I really believe in a cultural theology, and what I mean by that is how do we take certain Christian ghetto terms and understandings and scriptures and all these things that people like Dan Savage or people who are not Christians would never, you know, it's a logical fallacy to argue for using the Bible for your argument to someone who doesn't believe in the Bible, that doesn't think that's a legitimate form of argument or proof. And so ultimately what we're trying to do is, how do you take those biblical principles, and what I mean by that is there are these transcultural, transgenerational principles throughout the breadth of Scripture that are just applicable and just work. And so let me start with incarnation. For me, incarnation is more than a nice theological term. It has to be a way of life. There is power and authority and credibility based in proximity.
And it has to do with why you live where you live.
That is 100% the reason. Right. And here's the interesting part. If my organization were just still a Chicago organization, no one in Chicago has ever said anything bad about us. In fact, when we get attacked in the media, we have Chicago people, gay and lesbian people, evangelical pastors, everyone stands up for us and says, you don't know them. But here's the thing, when we made, or me, whether consciously or not, a decided decision to move our work outside of Chicago is when we then opened ourselves up for everybody to have an opinion about us. But let me get back to incarnation for a second. So here's my whole understanding about what it means to bridge opposing worldviews from a theological perspective. My favorite thing about Jesus is in Mark chapter 1. And in Mark chapter 1, Jesus heals a man with leprosy. And he tells this man, don't tell anyone what I just did. And then, in essence, he said, go to the temple, give the offerings according to the law of Moses that the priests tell you to give. That's an interesting thought, because if I were to heal somebody of the most scary disease of the day, I wouldn't tell them, go to the building that I came to destroy and rebuild in 3 days and submit to the law that I came to fulfill and listen to the people that are going to hang me on a cross and kill me. I would have said the exact opposite. But yet Jesus did say that, and here's the really important piece to what I feel that we can take from this, is that by Jesus ultimately saying, go to the building I came to destroy and rebuild in 3 days, submit to the law I came to fulfill, and listen to the people that are going to hang me on a cross, Jesus effectively took the broader worldview and metric of the day that really cared about the law, cared about the building, cared about the priests. He took that and placed it upon himself, and he's saying, okay, now I know the boundaries that I have to work within in order for something significant to happen in this culture, which is opposite of what we do today. What we do today is we take our worldview, we place it upon society, and we say, these are the boundaries that you need to work within in order for something significant to happen with me. And I just think there's
again, you're saying that regardless of the viewpoint of the group, we're all doing that. We're trying to pull each other toward, join my club, my way, or there's no way to...
So why instead, like Jesus, why don't we just step inside the metric that is presented to us? Doesn't mean we have a lack of conviction. Doesn't mean that we don't have a belief in truth. Doesn't mean that we're sellouts or we're capitulating to any outside agenda. It just means we are who we are in spaces that are not our traditional tribal aspects and understandings.
So one of the things that I find unique about Jesus and interesting is the freedom he lived in, and it's why I follow Jesus primarily, because I want to be free, and I see in him this capacity to live sort of untethered and not. He didn't have to report to people, and he didn't always tell people what he was up to. He didn't explain himself all the time. He wasn't going around qualifying himself. Right? Yeah. We'd all like that. And then he seemed to know who he was, move forward, all that kind of stuff. So we tend to think of Jesus classically as a religious leader or part of a religion called Christianity, and he was an observant Jew. And he did the things you just talked about. But what you're exploring seems to me to go beyond religion. It gets into what I would just call reality. It gets into day-to-day life, into culture. So when we start talking about incarnation or these things, this actually means like living inside of culture and living with people, living our life and authentically, right? Yeah. That's another way to talk about it. What is your thinking about, I feel like we need to help people reimagine who Jesus is, and your work in many ways is painting a picture of the possibilities of that. Does this ring bells for you?
Yeah. Well, we're trying, number one, but I am so happy that you said reality. That's something I talk about literally all the time in our daily life. So here's what happens in most cultural situations today is that people, doesn't matter what people group or population, but people have this ideal scenario in their head that they want to see happen that is not yet. And so in this ideal scenario, what they do is that they don't function in reality. They don't look at what's before them. Instead, they look to this ideal scenario and they say, well, it's going to be this one day, so therefore this is my reality. This is what I'm going to live in. And this is the reason why, I fully believe this. This is the reason why people get so surprised and why they're so shocked when things go differently than what they planned. Because they're not functioning in reality. They're functioning in their ideal scenario that they're pretending is reality. And so if we just do away with these ideal scenarios, it doesn't mean, sure, from a Christian perspective, I can't wait for Jesus to come back one day. It's going to be awesome. We're all going to be in heaven. You know, it'll be great. But until that point, why don't we function in reality? And reality is messy. And reality doesn't fit nice little boxes, and reality has antagonists, and reality has people who love you, and they have people who hate you, and people, you know, who are working off all these different understandings. And so we will be less surprised as a people, not just Christian people, as a people, when we actually start to look at reality as truth, as what is happening. Doesn't mean it's the capital T truth. Doesn't mean it's a theological truth. It means that reality before us is truth. And so these are the spaces that we need to function in, and we're just trying to recall people back to reality.
This is what, and Jesus did not tell us to agree with each other. He told us to love each other, which is a much more complicated thing to do than even agreeing. Agreeings are enough, right? But the idea of practicing love. So with that in mind, just how would you approach Dan Savage? Which, you know, with the idea of actually valuing him and what he has to contribute, and if he were to even consider, like, you know, having a conversation, what would interest you to talk with him about?
Yeah, well, first off, I've emailed Dan, and I've tried to reach out on a number of different occasions. I would love to sit down with that brother. If he was sitting right here, I would love to say, what is your outcome? What is your best case scenario for world? And what is my best case scenario for world? And I promise there's going to be a lot more commonality in that understanding. We might go about it in two different ways, but there is a more common understanding and a holistic nature between him and I. And there are people from all different shades, and people resonate with activist bulldogs, and people resonate with peacemakers, and you know, and so it's not just one right way. I would like to then ask him, you know, about the whole pluralism issue and all of that, and just get some clarity on those type of things. But from what we have learned, as I said at the beginning, the moment you sit down with somebody, they're a lot less threatening and a lot less bold in real life than they are behind a keyboard. And it doesn't matter if it's Dan Savage or myself or anybody else, you know, and just being in that space, once again, incarnation, being in that space, there's sacredness in-person interaction. And listen, my apartment is always open for him and his partner, and so I would love to see that happen one day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, man. Appreciate it.
Good.